Hi, I'm Jason Gore for ThatShelf.com, and we're here to talk about Jesus Christ Superstar.
Big shelf.
So fans of the site know that, again, I keep going on about JCS stuff, but this one is actually sort of a weirdly meta conversation. Those of you that watch the other video, we'll put it up here somewhere, know that the 50th anniversary version, the redux of the Brown album, the original concept album, also sort of, it's this sort of starburst one that's sort of behind me, resulted in much conversation. And my personal favorite one, the one that I sort of base all of my love of this insane musical on, is the movie version. Now, rightly or wrongly, the movie version has not been treated particularly well. Sure, there's been some cleanups of the video, but the audio's really not sort of stood up to the test of time in the way that all the cleanups of the Brown album were. And I've been annoying, as I sometimes am, suggesting on other fora how awesome it would be if this got cleaned up, other people agreeing with me, nudging dear Lord Andrew Lloyd Webber about whether there's anything can be done, all knowing his ambivalence about it. But I never really expected anything to be done, but I'd hoped for the anniversaries that we'd actually see some pretty significant things. Here we are 50 years after the film came out. And I saw an incredibly detailed and nuanced post on the Second Disc website. A really fantastic site. Definitely support them. They have a lot of fantastic reviews of discs on a regular time, all the time. And it was actually on their year-long list of the best things that sort of came out. I clicked again to read some of the conversation to see anybody who had responded to my, hey, we need to clean up the movie version. I saw this incredibly long, detailed post. I thought, well, this is interesting. And it kind of broke my brain because I learned something there that I had no idea about. After 37-something years of listening to this musical, I had no clue, had not noticed something that was, you know, in retrospect, should have been as clear as the nose on my face, and it's a big nose. Anyway, so I got in touch with the person that wrote the post. I think he has a really interesting story, and so this is the conversation we had. I hope you enjoy. Please let us know in the comments. We're doing something a little bit new here, having this kind of extended conversation, but I think it's something that we can actually continue and sort of dive into it on a more detailed basis for those of you that are fans of the musical, or for those of you that are simply fans of this kind of stuff and just want to dive in a little bit deeper, find more things, I guess, as it were, to put on that shelf in your home. So here we are. Please enjoy our conversation. Hello, Gibson. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to talk a little bit about Jesus Christ Superstar. It seems our mutual fetish, as it were. I learned about you because of a comment that you left on a website, which is kind of a weird way to learn about someone's existence, but here we are. But first, let's start a little bit about you. If you could tell me a little bit about yourself and where you first sort of fell in love with this crazy musical.
Okay, well, for those of you listening out there, my name is Gibson DelGiudice. That's how you pronounce that name. It's almost like it was written in the stars, really. I am currently, among many other things, a producer of Broadway-bound projects as well as film and television stuff. And I got into Superstar in what Americans would call the first grade. I was raised by a single mom and sort of searching for a father figure, or at least that's how I put it. And so I got obsessed with religion. And while rooting through my grandmother's record collection, I found the Brown album, and history was made.
And from there, like, do you have a musical background? Do you do performance yourself? I know you produce stuff, but are you actually a musician?
Yes, I sing with a local gospel choir, and performance-wise, you know, I pinch hit a little bit everywhere here and there.
Okay, perfect. Now, most people are fans of this musical, but you've taken to another level. You actually are one of the people that help run one of the main JCS fan sites, correct?
That's correct. Since 2007, 2008, somewhere around there, I want to say, I've been one of the co-admin and the head writer of our website content for Jesus Christ Superstar Zone. JesusChristSuperstarZone.com. Represent.
There we go. Okay, so the reason that we're actually chatting is because of a revelation, as it were. You broke my brain. So for 37 years or so, I have been listening to Jesus Christ Superstar, picking different versions. You can see I'm surrounded by only a few of my favorite versions. But it was always this weird debate, especially in high school, where I first sort of encountered the musical as a performer. The movie version or the Brown album, basically the concept album and the movie version. Now, for those that might not know, if you could give a very brief rundown of how the concept album happened and how it differs before we even get into the movie version, how it differs than how many musical soundtracks are actually recorded.
And you said this wasn't going to be a 6-hour chat. I'm going to try and compress this as much as I possibly can. So 1965, Andrew Lloyd Webber, basically a child prodigy, had his first composition published when he was 9, son of a director at the London College of Music at the time. He started to put himself out there trying to write musicals and such like for the professional stage. He was introduced by this agent wannabe who ran a bookstore in London named Desmond Elliott to Tim Rice, who had some experience in songwriting and producing in the pop world. And together they made a pretty interesting team. They wrote this musical called The Likes of Us, which was sort of an Oliver type thing that went nowhere. And then they had a little more success with their second project, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, which before it became the overblown monstrosity it is now, in my opinion, was a cute little 15-minute concert for a boys' choir at a London school. They were working on their next project and hit upon the idea of doing a rock musical about Jesus, which was something that Tim Rice had always wanted to explore artistically, though whether or not it would be a musical, that obviously came after he met Andrew. And because couldn't get any interest from mainstream producers, and realizing that most of their bread and butter was in the recording world at the time, they started shaking down record labels to see if they could get money to create what Tim Rice once called a super demonstration disc, the biggest demo ever recorded. And they eventually found backing from Decca, then a division of MCA, and put together this highly unusual, raw, youthful, fun rock opera about the last 7 days in the life of Christ from Judas's point of view. The album.
So to that point, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
So to that point, what I actually learned from the box set that I was unaware, I hadn't really got the chronology right. That they recorded the single, the Superstar single first, and then based on the success of that single, which actually didn't succeed very well in UK, but actually was quite a big hit in places like America, they actually were allowed to then, they thought that they would do the single, and the single would then allow them to do the stage show. And even that didn't work. So basically, then they put together the beginnings of a concept album, the Brown album, or in Britain, it's this sort of psychedelic version. But the original album, as it were, that many people grew up with. Is that a fair way of articulating it?
Yeah, that's a fair way of articulating it. The UK cover I personally called the Christ-like ghost head soup. It certainly looks like it, doesn't it? The album was like the initial Superstar single, not a huge hit in England. Jesus and questioning faith was never really a big deal there, in much the same way that John Lennon's "we're more popular than Jesus" comment made no real buzz there, but caused a massive shitstorm in the States.
Excellent use of the term buzz.
Yeah, well, that's the one lyric Tim Rice is still embarrassed about. He thinks it hasn't aged well. But anyway, the album was a resounding success enough that everybody wanted to get in on it. There were a rash of unauthorized groups, colleges, schools, churches, that sort of thing, doing it all over the States. And so they had to move quickly once impresario Robert Stigwood was in the picture handling the production end of things. They had to move quickly to make their imprint on it. And so they launched ultimately 3 different concert tours crisscrossing the US, one specifically for the college market, one starting on the East Coast, one starting on the West Coast. and then they would crisscross and take over other schedules. And they began developing the Broadway show behind that. And they began developing the film behind that because of some happenstance. Barry Dennen, who played Pilate on the original album and would ultimately play Pilate on Broadway and in the film, he was cast as Mendel, the rabbi's son, in Norman Jewison's screen adaptation of Fiddler on the Roof. He played Norman in the album. Norman had a vision, let's say. Very religious turn of phrase there. Norman had this idea for how it could work as a movie, and he met with a lot of skepticism. He pitched it to David Picker, who was I don't know if he was the CEO or the production head at United Artists, but United Artists was handling Fiddler. He said, I got this great album, and it's an opera, and I can see how the scenes between Jesus and Judas would play. Picker didn't get it. Norman, it's just an album.
Oh, yes.
And so he went to Universal, since they were another division of MCA and sort of by default wound up having the film rights. And he wrote them saying, if you develop Jesus Christ Superstar, you need to consider me. Of course, they got back to him and essentially said, what now? Because they were not at all aware it had not taken off yet to the extent that it did. So, but Norman was in on the ground floor from the very beginning. And ultimately, he pursued that vision quite successfully, I would say.
So again, one of the ironies being that Norman Jewison actually got Fiddler on the Roof because people thought he was Jewish, given his name. And of course, then he gets Jesus Christ Superstar because now that people know that he can do musicals, is the whole schlemazel, as we say. But back to the soundtrack, and this is sort of, I've teased the grand revelation, but this is it. So I learned that the single came out before the album, that the whole notion of the concept single before the concept album, that there's a different version of John 1941 in the back of the single. All of that was relatively new to me as part of the 50th anniversary. I just hadn't seen that or dug into the German single and all of that stuff. That was fine. It was like, oh great, I learned something a little, but it was not earth-shattering. Here's what was earth-shattering. The better my system has gotten, the more I have listened to my preferred version, the version that I fell in love with, which is the movie version. And we will get into details about that. But it was always, as I said, a debate about which one was the superstar you liked. Musically, I enjoyed so many little moments in the movie version. There's these little turnarounds, these little hooks, these little elements. And performance-wise, in terms of the singers, the Ted Neely, Carl Anderson duo, for me, just is transcendent. I got to see them live in the mid-90s. This is what everything is based on. It's either better or worse, but that is the baseline for me. But never in 37 years did I consider that the movie version, which has never sounded particularly great, couldn't be rescued. I always thought they just didn't care, that the master tape just sat there and languished. And as they kept remastering and doing better job on the Brown album, for lack of a better word, the concept album, the movie version was unable to be fixed. And that is where I read your comment. Could you sort of try to sort of briefly articulate why we cannot get the movie version, quote unquote, fixed, and what is the basis of the instrumental tracks on the movie version?
To allude to the second part of your question there, the basis of the instrumental tracks, as deep cut a listener as you are, I'm kind of surprised you didn't pick up on that, because I figured right away that it was either an exceptionally good imitation with all the resources that Hollywood has to offer, or a copy paste, which is a clue to what we're about to say. But let's get back to that beginning of that question. I commented on an article about the 50th anniversary re-release at a blog called The Second Disc, which is devoted to second disc theory. And either way, it's devoted to all these deluxe editions that have been coming out over the years of classic albums, new albums, what have you.
It's where idiots like you and me hang out. Yeah, absolutely.
Pretty much. Well, idiot smarts a little bit, but anyway. And
obsessives.
Obsessives is a better term. Yes. Or even
connoisseurs.
If you need to stick to idiots, half-witted fan spits. There was somebody in the comment section, maybe it was you, I don't know, but somebody brought up the fact that the movie version the soundtrack had just never sounded very good.
Mhm.
And every time it was re-released, which is very infrequently considering how good of a cash cow it's been for Universal over the years, it never got better when it was remastered. And so I hopped in with some knowledge that I picked up from my years of gleaning. And the answer to that is, at a baseline level, going back to square one, the music department on this movie was a bloody battleground, not unlike the beaches at Normandy on D-Day.
Golgotha.
Yeah, sure. We can go with Golgotha too. That's more on brand. When the initial album was constructed, put together, funded by MCA, all that sort of thing, it was like what... Have you heard the famous Frank Zappa quote about record executives back in the 60s, the who knows mentality?
Yeah.
Stick it on a record, put it out. Well, it was that sort of thing ruling the roost. And so they gave Andrew Lloyd Webber a bunch of money to play around, and he was pretty much fully in charge of the music. He had help from different conductors like Alan Doggett, who handled the choirs and some of the orchestras and stuff like that. But by and large, Andrew was allowed to rule the roost. And he got used to that level of control, as you can see from his artistic output to this day. But he did not have that level of control on the initial productions of Superstar.
I'm just going to pause for 1 second. I just want to inject this again, because we know a little bit more than some of the people who may be watching. So the original concept album, what they did was they got a bunch of rock musicians, straight up rock musicians from really great groups, Grease Band being the sort of fundamental one, who were the backing bands for Joe Cocker. And then they in turn sort of drew on a bunch of actual singers, people like Yvonne Elliman, who Andrew Lloyd Webber saw in a nightclub, but people like Ian Gillan, who was at the time the lead singer of Deep Purple. Now, Deep Purple hadn't done Smoke on the Water and hadn't had their giant hits, but nonetheless, they'd had Child in Time recorded that very specific period of British rock. They were absolutely there. So the concept album was absolutely not a musical album. It was a rock album that was done in line with the other sort of operatic rock albums of the time, the things like Tommy, other elements. That's what distinguishes this so dramatically. So the concept album, straight up rock album, and the orchestral stuff, again, Andrew Lloyd Webber, Doggett putting it together and assembling this version with relatively control, because MCA didn't particularly give a damn. They were these 20-something-year-old kids. I guess Rice was 24 and Andrew Lloyd Webber was 20, 21, something like that.
Tim was actually the older one. He was 26 and Andrew was 24, 25.
There we go. Okay. So thank you for correcting. So the point is they were preposterously young and getting all this stuff done. So there we are. So there's the concept album. Now the movie comes along. What happens with the movie?
Well, starting when the show moved to the theater with the original Broadway production, which Andrew Lloyd Webber was notoriously not a fan of, and to avoid going down that rabbit hole, just Google it or head to our website. They did not trust Andrew with the same level of control, be it on stage or on film, as he had of the music on the album. On stage, they called in this Broadway arranger named Hershey Kay, who's done a lot of fabulous shows, and indeed would work with Andrew Lloyd Webber again on the stage version of Evita. But basically, they hired this guy who Tim Rice says in his memoir was just the wrong person for the job. And Andrew ultimately got credit for the orchestrations, if you look at the playbills and the programs and stuff at the time, because he successfully argued that all Hershey had really done was shrink the resources of the album, which ultimately used 80 some odd musicians all told, not at the same time, but through overdubs and stuff like that. He basically shrank it to the conventions of what a Broadway pit orchestra could fit.
Yeah, it's sort of a de-orchestration, which is usually the opposite way of where most of this stuff happens. If you listen to a lot of cast recordings, they are minimal in order to fit in a pit. And one of the things I really enjoy when you actually have cinematic versions of several of these musicals is when you get really intelligent orchestrators that can take something that worked well on a 20-person pit orchestra and suddenly you have a 90 or 110-person orchestra, and it really sort of elevates that. So in a funny way, Jesus Christ Superstar on stage felt smaller than the record, especially during the time and given the technology. Please continue.
Yeah, and if you listen to the Broadway cast album, which is over
somewhere here, somewhere over there,
which is over Jason's left shoulder.
Yeah, there we are.
The one with Jesus in the long dress. you can hear the jazzy influences, the stuff that indicates that Hershey K was good at what Hershey K did. He was not necessarily so great at what Andrew Lloyd Webber did.
A lot more tenor sax.
And the symphonic component was vastly augmented for that album, as was traditionally the practice with Broadway albums, but it still sounds thinner than the concept album. Andrew thought that the days of that were over after he had pled his case. He was wrong, because as is usual, Hollywood holds the final, they have the final word. Unlike just ask any author, screenwriter, composer who's ever dealt with Hollywood. Hollywood has the final word. And they were not going to trust Andrew with that job either. So Norman Jewison went to a guy who had done several screen musicals, a jazz great named Andre Previn. And he said, come do this. Andre Previn didn't want the job. He's gone public. He's now passed away, but at the time he was alive, he went public on several occasions describing the score in no uncertain terms as shit and saying that he did it pretty much as a favor to Norman.
Now, Previn had worked with Norman before, had he not?
I don't know that specifically, but I do know that he had done a lot of Hollywood musicals to the extent that by about 73, 72, 73, he's the guy you call him.
And again, just to add some more flavor to this, so Andre Previn, obviously, one of those rare guys, a French, clearly, Andre Previn, who's known by many people now because of his connection to other familial disasters involving very, very famous film directors and their sometimes wife partner. But it gets very complicated about who Previn's involvement with. But nonetheless, Andre Previn himself was an incredible symphonic artist and a jazz artist. And he was one of the few that actually took elements of jazz and brought them into the classical world, especially in France, where, remember, so much of jazz that was being ignored in the United States was being celebrated as this unique American art form. Just like cinema was, in many ways, jazz was taken up by the French as this incredible improvisatory art in a way that it wasn't necessarily appreciated in North America. So you have a guy that should have absolutely been in line to see that if you take musical and rock and put it together, you can make something extraordinary. So on paper, he's an amazing choice. And yet, what happened? Other than him saying it's shit.
Other than him saying it's shit, Andrew Lloyd Webber was basically pitching a fit because he thought that, this would be his chance to shine. He already envisioned this massive sound for it. All he was doing was being given the Hollywood resources to do it. And in a similar way, Tim Rice kind of got shafted. He wrote a first draft of the screenplay. It was very Ben-Hur, very King of Kings, very epic in scale. Universal was looking to turn a thin dime from what they thought might be a passing fad. They were not going to spend biblical epic money. And so Norman Jewison, who was more interested in something on the scale of Pasolini's Gospel of St. Matthew, he didn't care for that treatment anyway, so he pretty much brought in Melvin Bragg, and he and Melvin Bragg did their thing on the screenplay. So all the way around, everybody wasn't getting exactly what they wanted as far as the original writers were concerned. Norman Jewison, as you'll hear on the DVD commentary for the film, which was recorded in 2004, he was very highly inspired by the album. He listened to the album for the first time when Barry Dennen introduced him to it. He developed all these images based on the album. And he and Melvin ultimately wrote the screenplay pretty much while scouting locations in Israel, listening to the album on Walkmans. I've seen the screenplay, several drafts of it. It is, when Ted says in that DVD commentary that it was the first long-form music video ever made, he wasn't kidding. It is timed down to the exact second. Everything is timed to match the album. So because he had written the screenplay, he and Melvin Bragg had written the screenplay that closely to the album, timing images to music and so forth, and with this vision in their head, obviously somebody like Andre Previn couldn't come in and do something radically different. So what they wound up doing was, aside from new material that had been either written for the stage version, in the case of Could We Start Again, Please, which Mary and Peter sing in the second act, and additional lines in the trial before pilot scene with the 39 lashes, neither of which were on the concept album.
What about Then We Are Decided?
Well, I'm going to get to that.
Right.
And in the case of material specifically written for film, such as Then We Are Decided,
Ta-da.
aside from material that needed to be newly recorded or had expanded some and needed rethinking, they basically copy pasted the rhythm tracks from anything that wasn't symphonic in nature, guitars, bass, drums, and so forth, from the concept album. They had to, because they'd basically written themselves into a corner, literally. Every segment in the screenplay was timed to the album because of this unusual conceptual process. So they wound up reusing huge chunks of the concept album wholesale.
Now,
which
in my defense, and this is exactly so. There's my revelation. You said this, and my initial response was, "You got to fucking be kidding me!" For almost 4 decades now, I have been listening to this nonsense and hadn't picked it up. And again, it's not that I'm an idiot entirely. You know, we've discussed my own inadequacies here, but in this, if you listen to them as standalone pieces, there are tons of little turnarounds, little licks. What's the Buzz be an excellent example that actually has this organ intro, little jam session that actually builds into it. And you can actually, if you're listening to it now, you can actually hear the tempo drop. So there's these moments that I always responded to. Plus, when they incorporated the elements from concept album, let's just call it Brown Album for sake of simplicity, even though that was really second pressing in UK and the first pressing in North America. The Brown Album version is much brighter, much more trebly, much more instrumental separation. And in the movie version, because it's buried not only under the symphonic stuff that they put on it, but also the type of EQ that they used, where they're really emphasizing the vocals. It's what often movie musicals do, is that they make it so that it needs to be coherent as dialogue. And so just like special effects get sort of downplayed, in this way, the musical elements get downplayed. That's often not the case on the cast recording. That the cast recording tends to be, it's often done the Sunday after the opening. In Broadway, this is a very famous thing to do, that they go watch the documentary company, it gives the whole spiel. But the deal is, then you have something that is mixed and recorded to be listened to as a musical act, rather than as something that you're in a theater hearing and needing to actually sort of pick out what the dialogue is. The movie soundtrack always prioritized vocals over instrumentation, and the instrumentation that was the same was buried under layers and layers of muck. And you couldn't really pay attention. And where there were differences, the differences are significant. Yes. And so it's, for me, I literally thought, you're nuts. And then I realized maybe I cannot believe I've noticed this. Like my whole life, something's been sitting in front of me and I hadn't noticed that it had been sitting there. And I went back and listened to What's the Buzz? And I'm like, this is not the same at the beginning. Of course this isn't the same. And then boom, I'm like, oh my God, every single line is there. So 100%, you are correct. You're not alone. Everybody knew this and I didn't. but that they used as bed tracks. The Brown Album. Let's go back to other Andrew Lloyd Webber. It's not like I didn't know when they released the 3 recordings of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat in the 90s that it's the same orchestration. That when they did Les Mis versions, it's the same. That the Australian and New Zealand versions are the same with different vocals on it. These are very, very obvious. Whereas this one, because of 2 reasons. 1, as you mentioned, there are new songs. 2, the songs that are the same have different musical elements with the rock band incorporated. Either different takes from Brown Album, this is what I want your opinion on, or other elements from the same session that clearly, when they were editing the film, they needed to stretch certain scenes out in order for it to breathe because of montage. And then 3, just complete, it's a demonstration of what equalization can do to make you think that something is totally radically different. Like if you ever want to know what a remix can do, here's your example of that. So there's sort of my breakdown. When did you know about this? Or the first time you listen, you're like, oh, they sound the same to me.
Well, in all honesty, the first time I listened to them, they really did sound the same to me.
Right.
But it was only a suspicion, because this is, I didn't have access to that information as a kid. Now that I've moved up in the superstar world, I do have access to information. Members of our forum who had interviewed cast members, creative team, and stuff like that for the website spoke to the late Barry Dennen and to Tim Rice on Facebook, and they recalled that some tracks from the concept album were used, which was already enough ammunition for me, but I wanted to be clearer on that.
Mm-hmm.
We recently gained access to the entire production file for the film, which were donated with Norman Jewison's papers to the Wisconsin Historical Society archives. Everything that isn't on microfilm, we have in PDF. The entire production file for the film, shooting schedules, memos, people who were submitting resumes for casting, lists of people who came to auditioning. Virtually every 70s and 80s celebrity or future celebrity auditioned for this, including John Travolta, Irene Cara, Barry Bostwick, all kinds of people. Tim Curry.
Tim Curry would have been very interesting.
Yeah, indeed. And among the things that were there were like recaps of the playbacks that they used on the set, details about what had been recorded, what was yet to be recorded, and stuff like that, even down to the musicians who worked on segments of new tracks or new tracks entirely. And we can confirm that the vast majority of the film soundtracks, fed tracks, come from the concept album.
For those that do not, is it still the Grease Band?
Members of it, yes. It's the same drummer. Henry McCullough is still on guitar. I would say at least 3 out of like 4 or 5. Yes. Yeah. The vast majority of it was musicians brought back in from the concept album in terms of rhythm tracks. And there were some other famous session players like Ollie Halsall, John Fitty, both on bass, for different tracks. But yeah, the vast majority of it was the same band, which helped maintain the continuity that you perceived.
And that's it. I mean, so many of the bass licks and some of the elements, if you listen to the whole thing, there's enough songs that are different that I never clued into the songs that are the same, if that makes any sense. Again, I seem defensive, and this is a revelation as opposed to being something that I'm defensive about. I think this is amazing. But it accounts for the why we can't necessarily have a cleaned up version of the movie version, because what they did for many of the tracks is take the Brown album version and make it worse musically, sonically. That they just layered nonsense. They layered equalization. They took re-recording. They just took copies of the recording and then incorporate that into a greater mix. Is that a fair thing to say?
That is a fair thing to say. To hop on to some other stuff about the question that you asked first, was any of the extended material from alternate takes from the Brown album? The 50th anniversary deluxe set that you alluded to actually confirms that for a fact. If you listen to the guide vocal, the Herod song track, for example, you hear the little piano solo in the instrumental section, the little breakdown, which is, that's as elaborate as you hear it in the film. It is much simpler on the Brown album. They absolutely used earlier takes or material that was not heard on the album just for variety or because they thought it was a better take. There's a lot of positive organ on I Don't Know How to Love Him that's not on the album track, but if you listen to earlier or alternate vocals from that release set, you can hear most of that positive organ track that you hear in the movie. There is a lot of that's there. As for the sonic issues with the soundtrack album, it basically sounds like it was recorded with 2 tin cans and some twine with the cast shouting down a barrel. The movie, I will say this for the movie, which was mixed naturally with these old cinema sound systems in mind that were used to 50s movie musicals and not to something as revolutionary as a rock opera. The vocals in the movie, by and large, sound much better than on the album, which sounds literally like they just stuck a mic through the well up at the screen.
Oh, everybody's talking like this.
Yes, basically, yeah. And it literally sounds like they were recording in the next room to a print being screened in the cinema, at least in my own imagination. And
I will say it sounds particularly horrendous using contemporary compression methodologies. So on CD, it was always not great, but so musically and fun and vivacious that it was great. When you'd watch the film, it was totally different because, as you say, it's clearer on the cinema. But on record and on CD, it was fine. But if you hear it now on streaming, or the more revealing your turntable setup, yeah, it sounds worse and worse. Either way you go. If you have very high-end equipment, it sounds terrible. And if you have significant compression, it just compresses the compression, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And Hollywood, as I alluded to with their intention of avoiding the biblical epic treatment, was not wasting any more time on this soundtrack than they did on other musical soundtracks. Ted Neely characterized it to me as when they went in to do the pre-records that they would sync to on the set and then correct anything that didn't match in post-dubbing. He said that there was no producer to speak of. There were rarely any musicians in the studio. There was an engineer who might as well have been picked out of a hat from Central Casting, who pretty much punched the record button, cued them to sing, and then said, okay, usually after a single take. On the one hand, amazing considering the vocal performances they got in single takes for the movie.
So just so we get the timing right, they would have recorded the album, done the bass bed tracks, recorded the vocals that would end up on the album.
Yes.
Shot the movie. Those tracks are being used for playback, so that's what they're lip syncing to.
Yes.
After the fact, they would have been in a studio, likely a professional studio with much better mixers and much better people at the board, doing essentially ADR, automated dialogue replacement. But rather than dialogue, they're replacing their vocal takes. They're actually redoing the songs. So if you listen to the movie version of the movie versus the soundtrack to the movie version, radically different performances in terms of what they're doing.
Oh, yes. And you can hear that in specific touch points. The example I always give people is Jesus at the end of Strange Thing Mystifying, not one of you. In the movie, it is acted, he echoes throughout the cave, like it is chilling in that moment. It's basically a wet fart on the album. No offense to Ted, but he played it much mellower there.
I mean, we will have many more conversations just to irritate the many people. We can talk about how the end of Simon's shout, that the edit sort of holds on while he's holding the note and doesn't actually allow him to close his mouth. We can get into the weeds very easily, my friend. That'll be another conversation.
Well, funny you bring up Simon, because the little vocalizing you hear over the added instrumental section in the movie, which clearly sounds like it's coming from live on-set audio, badly dubbed onto the track, not on the album. Yeah. Another example to point out of the differences.
And that's literally where we're going. We're now on the same page, my friend. Yeah. Okay. I'm just saying, as I said to you, I come proper. I realize that I'm dealing with an expert, but I have some legitimacy to be part of this conversation.
So, you do.
So, Brown album gets put into the Blue album. Yeah. They put all this stuff on. We get these other people in. We have the orchestral stuff done. And there are certain tweaks to the score, if you contrast Brown album to this, that are notable. That some ways are sympathetic and better. I always gave Previn credit for that. He's one of the great artists of that period of the 20th century. And you're suggesting not only did he think he was shit, it was shit, rather. You're saying potentially he had less to do with it than we would expect. If you could tell me that part of the story.
In fact, I will go even further. Yes, he was so dismissive of the work that he farmed out some of the orchestration to the late Angela Morley, who was a very talented orchestrator in her own right. If you're not familiar with her work, look her up. You may have to look some of it up under the name Wally Stott, because like Wendy Carlos, she was one of the early transgender greats in the music industry. He farmed out the work to Angela Morley. We don't know exactly what Angela did. All the fact that we even know about it was that Angela reported it in several bios, and it's even on Wikipedia, but she never received screen credit. So we don't know exactly what Angela did. We have only the memories 40, 50 some odd years later from cast members who worked with him on limited occasions of what Andre did in the studio. And as far as the rhythm tracks are concerned, that was basically pre-baked 3 years prior in most cases.
So again, to reiterate, you have to have all that stuff locked down before you shoot a frame of footage.
Oh, yes.
Your notion that everything was done basically almost to the second, so it was almost pre-edited like a music video, meant that they had to use as the basis anyway the tempo match to the Brown album, which again, for those musicians out there, was never recorded with a click. This was not something that was done. It was done with the looseness and the tempo variations of a rock band. It was allowed to breathe. It was not one of these sort of digital performances that we're so used to these days. So then you have the orchestral elements, so we do not know for a fact what Previn did or what Previn didn't do. We just know that he probably had more uncredited assistance than is normally being. Is that a better way of articulating it, or are we literally saying that Previn had nothing to do with this?
We are not literally saying that he had nothing to do with this. In fact, there are incidental cues that he is credited for in the production file. Of course, whether or not Angela wrote any of that is a matter of, or contributed to any of that is a matter of conjecture, because she's not credited. But Andre is credited for several little cues, like there's a cue called The Desert, which is as the opening shot of the movie sweeping over the desert before it settles on the ruins that will form the main set for the piece. Everything before the first chord of the overture as you know it from the album and from countless stage versions over the past 50 years, that's a Previn cue. When Jesus is thrown
it's essentially two chords, but yes.
more or less, yes. And he even draws from other stuff. Things like
it's a minor second.
The ghostly choir singing Pilate's name at the end of Pilate's Dream. That's technically a Previn cue.
Interesting, because that is now in the stage musical, and sometimes they actually incorporate some of those elements into the stage musical, which is inevitably happens, is that the movie version comes out and then it gets incorporated.
I will have the caveat that if they do that, they're doing that themselves under their own gumption and at their own peril, because it's certainly not part of the score as licensed by Andrew Lloyd Webber, and he is famously not a fan of what Previn did. Right. Having said that, another example of a cue that Previn wrote was the Jesus, after Could We Start Again, Please, is thrown by the soldiers into a pit that I guess is a holding cell. And I only know that because it's in the screenplay. A lot of this was abstract, and they wound up working with a lot of different sets than they initially planned.
He gets chucked into a cave.
They planned to use actual sets in Jerusalem of actual holy sites, like the Citadel, which was purportedly where Christ was actually tried before Pilate, things like that. There were a lot of places that they ultimately couldn't use in Jerusalem, both due to blowback from the Israeli government and from just deciding keep it out in the desert as much as possible, because Jerusalem and other cosmopolitan areas are too modernized to pass as ancient. So that cue, which incidentally sounds like a similar cue which plays over the scene of the massacre of the innocents in Pasolini's Matthew. Nod for Jewison, probably a little gift from Andre since he did it as a favor to him. That cue is a Previn cue, things like that. And there were other Previn cues that were like elaborations on Webber themes, and they break that down, like some of the music in the temple, which is much longer and drawn out and 70s and destructive as Ted nearly smashes up the joint. Stuff like that was also Previn. It's like credited Previn using themes by Webber.
Got it.
Previn, Webber, Previn using themes by Webber, Webber, Webbin, all that.
Webbin probably is a better way of actually putting it. I like that. And it's funny because so much of that stuff is so embedded in me as the texture of Superstar that I still find that stuff absent in the other versions. And that's what I'm saying, is whichever one you sort of saw as your definitive. So all those elements, which absolutely, I'm glad that we sort of settle on that, whether they're Previn or whether like every person who has ever done any movie music has had assistants to do orchestration and other elements. John Williams is 12 people, right? Like you're not giving these individuals, however that all played out. Those elements I miss often when you actually are listening to the straight up stage musical, because those were the ones that I sort of immediately fell in love with. The moment just before Peter's denial, there's a little sort of musical sort of jam session right at the beginning. Clearly,
Previn cue.
What?
Previn cue.
Yeah, but exactly. So clearly meant to just be there because I got to go from this scene to this scene, so we need 30 seconds of something. It's great. It's a jaunty little thing that then just kicks in. The edit is like so preposterously on the beat that you just can feel the different tape kick in. Now I realize not only that, it's a different performance. It's a different band. It's the Brown album kicking back in the funny way.
Yeah.
It's like
Yes.
we've changed the CD section to the next track.
And you can hear that really, really well. I should plug this. In 2017, a French distributor called Elephant Films, which specializes in deluxe releases, usually just for the French market, they put out a DVD Blu-ray combo pack of Superstar, a complete digital remaster from a vintage 70mm print, all that happy horse shit. And one of the big features, special features, is a karaoke track. No vocals, just the music and the sound effects.
Oh my God.
It is trippy to watch the movie that way. I have the isolated tracks, and I'm not saying I'll send them to you, but they'll find out.
No. I didn't know this disc existed. I can't believe. Again, thank you for letting me know. I'll track down the disc somehow.
You get to hear all of it. You get to hear, like, somebody clearly sat on the control panel during Heaven on Their Minds. You hear the tape warp at one point. Things like.
I mean, inevitably, and again, back to sort of where I come from as a movie guy. So many times, especially for musicals, I'm really fascinated listening to the alternate language tracks, because that way you can really hear different isolated moments, and basically you have a bed track of the instrumentation, and that's how you have different people singing. The French language version of this movie, I have the soundtrack for, very, very different. But again, I was hoping that that album would have better instrumental tracks because they would have messed with it less. No, it's as egregious. Again, I bought versions, the Japanese press, that the Japanese are famous for not messing with master tapes. My friend who will hopefully be watching this at some time, who shares my connection with Jesus Christ Superstar, the two of us sort of came up together with it. He refers to Japanese in a beautiful way as sort of raw vegan audio, that they like what's on the tape that we're never meant to hear. Whenever you're making a record, of course, it's meant to be mastered, it's meant to go on. But when they produce this stuff, it's like, just give me what's on the tape, even though the only person who's ever supposed to hear that was an engineer. And even this sounds terrible. Right?
Yeah. Yes. It's marginally loud. That's about it.
Yeah, but that's wild. So you're saying that I have a disc from France that I got to pick out.
Oh yeah, and I'll even send you a link. You can
that's
put it in the
perfect.
description.
Perfect. Leave a link in the
Let's do this
description.
for everyone.
Perfect. Sounds great. So we have basically the collision of these two things, that the movie version, as much as I want it cleaned up, even for those tracks that were newly recorded, we might not be able to have access to those because there's a potential catastrophe that befell some of those tapes. If you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Around the 40th anniversary of the movie's release in 2013, a promoter named Frank Munoz, who's worked with a ton of people, Metallica and stuff like that, he happened to be a friend of Ted's. He said to Ted, "What are you guys doing for the 40th anniversary?" Ted said, "It's been 40 years," jokingly. And then he said nothing. So Frank said, "Let's book a screening at Grauman's Chinese. If people come, great. If not, we'll just watch the movie in its optimal setting and have a few laughs." That spawned a screening tour that continued into the teeth of the pandemic. It just kept coming back and coming back. Cast member reunions, Q&As with the audience, sing-alongs, costumes contests. It's Superstar Palooza, basically. And it's still been doing its thing coast to coast all over the country. They recently did a screening this past fall in Boston, even. And as part of that, riding that pony, Frank went to Universal because it was time for a proper 40th anniversary remaster. Anybody who's heard the Sonics on the album as it currently exists has been thirsting for that since 1973. And what he learned from Universal was, and this is based on studio documentation, which purports that this stuff is where it's supposed to be. Assuming everything is where it's supposed to be, much of the album is at Universal's storage at Pinewood Studios in England, and the rest was on site in Universal City, California, at Universal's own facilities. Now, any fan of just about any classic rock artist has heard about the June 2008 Vault Fire at Universal, and it's our understanding, based on the documentation, that among the Superstar film soundtrack master tapes that were at the Universal City Vault, 3 reels went up in smoke with the rest of all the priceless master tapes that went up. Those 3 reels constitute everything from This Jesus Must Die through the leper sequence. So that is gone, lost to the ages.
Hypothetically. And the reason that you are you're doing a caveat is we are learning more and more that the documentation about what was there during the fire is almost as egregious as the fire itself.
Yeah.
And masters that should have been there for secure keeping were actually in worse secure locations that didn't have a fire.
Yeah.
And so there's a very real possibility that they're just somewhere, and may in fact turn up. But yes, no, the twin disasters of archival incompetence and giant fire are colliding. Steely Dan's Asia being an excellent example of one that people now think the master tape might actually still exist. They just don't know where.
Don't forget to add to that pile executive indifference. Universal supplied this information to Frank, but they have never been interested in getting behind this. I don't understand why. It turned a nice profit considering they spent $3.5 million on it and it made $10.8 million at last count in rentals. But Universal is not prioritizing their back catalog. They've only just begun to do that, for which see La La Land Records and the Universal Pictures Film Music Heritage Collection releases recently. Universal is not prioritizing this. Every year, they're still surprised that there are requests for screenings even. Like, they are not wasting any time on this.
And so this is also critical. You have Norman Jewison, who, God bless him, is prioritizing his health right now. It's getting a little bit on in age. It isn't quite the power that he was before, and certainly not something that he's focused on. You have Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, who are at best ambivalent about the film. You have other people who would have been involved at the time that would have been fighting for this type of restoration, focused much more on the presentation of the Brown album than they are about the movie. And so there's a very real possibility that this is as good as we're ever going to get, that the Blu-ray is as good of a quality as we will ever get, that we're not going to get a 4K, and even if we did, it will just be a mediocre upres. We're never going to get this film treated in the way, for example, we're expecting some major things like Sound of Music and Sing in the Rain, and those elements that are treated with at their musicals, but they're treated as absolute touchstones of studio output. Even something like Rocky Horror Picture Show would be treated as the cash cow for 20th Century Fox / Disney in a way that Jesus Christ Superstar never has, that you have a film that had much lower production values, much lower probably need for cleanup, as it were, of a true restoration. We're simply highly unlikely to see that with Jesus Christ Superstar as much as maybe you and I want that.
And it's not for lack of trying. I mean, my sleuthing on the internet has turned up things like an orphaned website for the Robert Stigwood organization when he sadly passed away 5 years ago that was promising a 4K restoration of Superstar back then. Like, there were people who had ideas about that. It's still floating around in the ether that they were going to try and do something like that. Right now, what we've got is a 2K restoration that was done in 2004, specifically for the DVD I alluded to, which added commentary by Norman and Ted. That was the basis for the Blu-ray. It was, until about 2017 or so, the basis for the remastered print used at the screenings that I just spoke about. Now they've switched to the French Blu-ray that I just told you about, because it's much better quality.
So the French, just so we get into the weeds on that, obviously it was never shot on 70, it was shot on 35, but it's basically they probably sourced a better 70 print than was used for the 35 print, because even the Blu-ray isn't straight for negative. It's a scan from essentially either an interpositive or some sort of release print that they used to make the Blu-ray, which still looks okay, but it's certainly not as good as that film could look.
And indeed, there are issues with it depending on the release. As you're aware, they wound up shooting Gethsemane during the day in the same time as the Last Supper sequences and threw a night filter on it. There is at least one recent release where the night filter might as well not be there.
Right.
Just
the joys of color timing.
Yes. Yes.
So this is, we're only scratching the surface of one particular thing, but I just wanted to get your sort of impressions on it. Now, you know my views on it. For you, what is your view if you had to choose one? If you could live with one recording between these two, we'll get into other recordings later, but just between these two, which is the one that you personally connect with?
The movie, without question. I'm aware that I said earlier that I found the Brown album in my grandmother's record collection. What I neglected to say was we did not have a turntable. So to expand on that teal deer version of my discovery of Superstar a little bit, shortly after that, we went to a video store in our area. Remember video stores, kids? Pepperidge Farm remembers. And I spotted Superstar on the shelf. I said, oh, this is a movie too. And that was the first of many rentals until we purchased it on video and then on DVD later and so on and so forth. And so the movie was the first thing to make an impression on me, just by sheer virtue of the fact that we didn't have a turntable at the time. Once we got one or contacted a relative who had one, I listened to the Brown album and was able to appreciate the similarities, the differences, and so forth. But it was the movie. And like you've said a couple of times in this conversation, it's your first love. It's the one that you experience first that will always stick with you. And for me, it'll always be the movie.
And Ted and Carl are so definitive in their roles for me in a way that even as much as I love what, even Ben Vereen did in the New York Broadway, it gets a little bit complicated. I'm stepping over myself here, but I go back to the whole notion of, as a film critic, of what food critics often do, is that they love restaurants where they're getting something that they've never had before. So that a lot of them can't even appreciate a steak anymore because they want something that's micro-gastronomy, right? So they're tired of the normal, like a rack of lamb is so banal and pedestrian that they've lost it. I do my critical work sort of on the opposite of that, is that I love the weird and the different and the insane. I love the Muppet version. I love the Indigo Girls version. I love the insanity of the Australian cast where you're colliding heavy metal and dance music. I love the Moog version. I love the surf version. I love all this weirdness because it is a theme and variation on what I believe to be the definitive version, which is the movie version. And the fact that the movie version takes for me everything that Broadway attempted in terms of messing around and doing that stuff, that incorporates those Previnian elements, as we're going to give him credit for that. Sure. And the fact is that it still had the funk of the Brown album. This actually, in a funny way, makes the movie version even better, because why would you replace the Grease Band if you don't have to? Right? Why wouldn't you take what the Grease Band's doing and just add those little elements that weren't there before? That little hook, the little element at the beginning of the track. And so in a funny way, it makes me both love the movie version more and be more heartbroken that we're never going to get one that actually sounds the way we'd probably want it to sound.
Well, I would never say never. Without tipping my hand too far about things that might possibly be construed as copyright infringement, there have been very enterprising fans on our forum taking advantage of things like AI vocal separation and splitting things into little stems and stuff like that. It's basically a poor man's version of what Abbey Road's been doing with their D-Mix system, right, on recordings of execrable quality and turning shit into Shinola, basically. It might not come from official sources, but you might hear something better.
Look, the fact of the matter, again, as a movie guy, it's not like people haven't been doing this with other films that they love, often involving space. So
ProudFanEdit.org user. Shout out to them.
So that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, nothing would please me more than for the studio to get behind and recognize what a treasure this film really is. It is so of its time. It is so preposterously this collision between the insanity of these two British kids putting together this rock musical, this crazy guy from Toronto that hired almost all the cast, the background cast, the dancers, the choreographers, all those elements are an incredible Canadian connection. Going to Israel at a time when going to Israel was a big deal to shoot something there. It was between the two major wars that they played out.
Yeah.
I love the fact that they didn't use Tim Rice's script, because Tim Rice's script would have been terrible. I love the elements that make this film what it is, the sort of postmodern collision of the bunch of hippie idiots going in, because I have enough time and distance away from when it took place that it didn't feel out of date. The whole area felt out of date. There's so much for me to love about this film, independent of my love of the music, that I would love to see it treated with the respect that it deserves. And I love that there are people like you and the people that you collaborate with that are doing what you can, not just as fans, just talking. I mean, it's so easy now on the internet just to shit on things, just to find things to complain about this. You've helped create a community of people that actually care, that are educating, that are doing that. Your post wasn't "fuck you, you idiot," for asking for this. It's like, actually, here's a background. Here's why it's going to be challenging. I agree with you that I would love this to happen, but it's probably not going to, sort of break your heart. But here you are, right? It's a very different thing than normally takes place on the internet. And so God bless. You got a Jew that loves Jesus Christ Superstar, right? That absolutely, on a fundamental basis, believes strongly that this recording and this version deserves more than it's currently getting. And if in a small way, this tiny conversation we're having can convince somebody who wasn't aware of the situation to get beyond it, to get in touch with Norman, to get in touch with the studio and see if there's stuff we can do during our lifetime, I think that would be phenomenal.
Stranger things have happened, not to name drop, but Andrew Lloyd Webber's oldest daughter just followed me on TikTok.
There you go.
I ammed me entirely out of the blue. So we'll see. You never know. You never know whose heart we might turn. Andrew Lloyd Webber's disdain for this movie, to delve into that for a short second, not only came from lack of control, but also the circumstances in which he saw it. He saw it in Chicago a year later in mono. Now, if you hate the sound of this album in stereo, if you thought the sound mix was shitty, given the elements we have now, imagine it in mono.
Right. And look, he's had a complicated relationship with cinematic versions of his films. I believe Evita is one of the great films of the half century, let alone a great musical. And then we have some others that sort of were not quite as good, shall we say.
I'll join Patti LuPone in saying pity about the lead, but other than that, yes, I agree with you about it.
Exactly. Yes. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the rest of the play?
Yeah.
But we will see. So what I would love to do, I'd love to continue our conversation. I'd mentioned this before. We have many other things that we could probably nerd out about, different versions, different elements. So where we went when we had the movie and sort of building up on this. And I would also love, I mean, maybe you and I, we can actually start some of those conversations. Let's get Ted on here. Let's see if we can get Andrew on the record about all this stuff. Sir Andrew, excuse me, Sir Tim, and actually go from there. We'll see how that all works.
Have to correct you. Sir Tim is correct. Lord Andrew.
Lord Andrew. Is it Lord Sir?
Baron Lloyd Webber of Sidmonton.
But he was also knighted, so isn't he like Lord?
He was also knighted, but I don't think the knighting counts once you become a baron, once you become a member of the House of Lords.
Don't you become like Lord Sir? It's like Dr. Miss. I don't know. Regardless, Andy and Timmy, let's get them on here and see what they actually have to say about this. For those of you,
better luck with Tim.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for our conversation. It's such a pleasure to meet you, virtually, as it were, to share this passion, as it were, again, to use a very JCS word. Thanks so much for your time on this. Is there anything else that you would like to know? Any fans, a way that they have to follow you, some way that they have to interact?
Well, sure. Don't interact with me personally, because I'm no great shakes. My best work is still yet to come. But in terms of superstar content, JesusChristSuperstarZone.com. If you go to JesusChristSuperstar.net, it'll take you to the same place. We are on Facebook. We have a group that is growing. We thankfully just passed 666 members today. We also have a forum at our website, which has been around much longer and has a little more history than you might be getting on the Facebook group. But yeah, just follow us on social media. We're on Facebook. We have our own website, our own forum, and we have our own YouTube channel with a vast selection of out of print and rare recordings to stream for yourself. Bet you didn't know Kurt Yajin played Judas after playing Ennis in the movie. We've got the bootleg. It's on our channel.
Again, I want to have a whole conversation. We didn't even get into Ted and Carl and how they became there. We haven't talked about the Hollywood Bowl concerts. We have a lot that we can actually sort of dive into that, and we'll do that at another time. For now, thank you so much. For those of you who watched, thanks so much. Please subscribe. Please let us know in the comments what you think about this. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time. All the best.
We can keep talking when we're done recording, right?
Stop recording.